Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new edition of virtual book talks. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi, the director of Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Before I introduce our author and discussant today, let me go over some logistics. The entire conversation would be less than an hour, and Professor Shahrokni will present her book for 15 minutes or so, and Professor Rinaldo would respond and raise some questions for 10 minutes, and then Professor Shahrokni would respond to those questions for a few more minutes, and then I would take the questions from the audience, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's a great pleasure to me to introduce Dr. Nazanin Shahrokni, who's Assistant Professor of Gender and Globalization at the Department of Gender Studies, where she also directs the master's program in Gender and Development and Globalization at London School of Economics. She has a PhD in sociology from University of California at Berkeley. Prior to joining the Department of Gender Studies at the LSE, she held positions in various international settings, such as Syracuse University, Lund University in Sweden, and Harvard Academy of International and Area Studies, and the American University in Beirut. She currently serves on the executive board of International Sociological Association, as well as on the editorial board of the journal Middle Eastern Women's Studies. Her work focuses on the intersection of gender politics, feminist geography, and ethnographies of the state in Iran, the Middle East, and beyond. She brings a critical lens and an ethnographic sensibility to the study of gendered public spaces and spheres, the reconstruction of gender difference in city spaces, and the complex gendered underpinnings of urban governance and political institutions. I'm also pleased to report that Professor Shahrokni's book was awarded the 2020 Latife Yar Shater Award from the Association of Iranian Studies. Responding and raising some questions to Dr. Shahrokni is Dr. Rachel Reynaldo, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She has a PhD from University of Chicago and is a cultural sociologist interested in gender, globalization, and social change and religion, with a special focus on developing world Muslim societies in Southeast Asia. She has conducted field work in Indonesia since 2002. Her first book, Mobilizing, Piety, Islam, and Feminism in Indonesia, was published by Oxford University Press in 2013. The book is an ethnographic study of Muslim and secular women activists in the country with the world's largest Muslim population. Often it surprises people when we think of Indonesia as the country with the largest Muslim population. She has published her work in journals such as Gender and Society, Qualitative Sociology, and Social Forces. She's working currently on a number of projects, including the study of marriage and divorce in urbanizing Java, a study of how global and transnational processes are influencing the emergence of the contemporary art scene in Southeast Asia, and very timely, the study of gender and family dynamics in the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. So without further ado, let me introduce my friend and colleague, Nazanin Shahrokni, and the screen is yours, Nazanin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gamari Tabrizi. I'm really grateful for this space and opportunity, and I'm particularly delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Reynaldo here. We go back to, I don't know, not so long ago, but anyway, I've always appreciated our conversations around issues of gender and Islam. So, and I look forward to kind of the broader conversation, hopefully with all of you here on the stream, but also with the participants who are just numbers for me right now. 43, that's great. I also wanted to apologize in advance. I'm a little bit feeling under the weather, so I usually bring a lot of energy and enthusiasm into my conversations and talk. I may fail to do so, but I try. The company might keep me energized, so I apologize in advance. If I may share the screen, just so that the visuals might compensate for my lack of energy today. So these are just the titles of each chapter, and I thought it might be good to share it with the audience here. Just a little bit about the book. The book obviously is about the politics of gender segregation in Iran, and broadly it kind of engages with and deals with women's public presence in Tehran. The method I've used is that I've used I bring together microanalysis based on around 19 months of ethnographic fieldwork between 2009 and 2014. And then I combine this with a macro level analysis of state institutions and policies. And the way it worked was that obviously for the ethnographic part, I visited these different spaces, which I will talk about shortly, but also I interviewed women in those spaces. But I also did archival research from 1979 to 2014 of parliamentary kind of minutes, but also news reports and news stories, so newspaper archives and Zanaruz magazines and Zanan magazines of the past 4 decades. I also did interview with state officials and city officials to the extent that was possible to get a sense of, because part of my concern was that how do policymakers actually envision the relationship of women with the city, and how does this vision change over time? So obviously I needed to do some interviews with people who were involved in policymaking processes. The book takes us on a ride in gender segregated buses inside a women-only park called Behesht Madaran, the Mother's Paradise, and outside the closed doors of sports stadiums, particularly Azadi soccer stadium, where women are banned from attending men's soccer matches. I contend that an analysis of the Iranian state's gender policies, here gender segregation, is not complete without an understanding of the various actors involved at local, national, and global level. So I don't look at the Iranian state from the perspective of, let's say, members of the parliament or city councils members of or the mayors. I also look at the interaction of various actors with, for example, in the case of the stadium, with FIFA, or with Asian Football Confederation, or in the case of buses, for example, I look at the interactions between the state and WHO or the World Bank. I also look at the entanglement of diverse sets of interests and the subsequent tensions and struggles that unfold in everyday spaces over the form and the intensity with which these policies, gender segregation policies, are implemented. So what we see in Iran, just very quickly, because I've been given only 10-15 minutes to talk about the whole book. I believe most of the audience who's here already knows Iran, but anyway, for those who want to get a visual sense of gender segregation, these arrows point to the metal bar on the bus, the curtain that goes into the Caspian Sea and divides women's swimming section from the men's. On the left bottom, we see one of the women-only parks, which is basically is there's a green metal sheet or wall around it, and then these are the White Scarf Girls, the feminist campaign that was formed against the ban on women's attendance in Azadi Stadium. So this is the gate of the Azadi Stadium. I'll get to this in a second. Let me just go to the main argument of the book. So what I argue is that in general, when we think of gender segregation, a few things come to mind: gender discrimination, gender domination, Islam, and an attempt to exclude women from public spaces. But here's how I situate myself vis-a-vis this argument. What we see in Iran, I contend, is that gender segregated spaces shifted from functioning as spaces of exclusion aimed at restricting women's movements in the city, which was the predominant regime of gender segregation during the 1980s, to spaces of inclusion, allegedly to facilitate women's presence in urban public spaces. The shift from one regime of segregation to the other reflects and is enabled by a shift in the state's mode of regulation from prohibition, what I call the disabling of undesired effects, to provision, the enabling of desired effects. Although the form and intensity of gender domination have varied over time, I argue that the changing balance in the state's mode of regulation from prohibition to provision is managed through the discourse of protection and is consistently accompanied by the characterization of the state as protector, from protecting women's virtue and chastity in the name of Islamic morality to protecting women's rights and safety in the name of secular liberal citizenship. So let me just quickly go over these two regimes of gender segregation. I already covered mode of regulation. Also, I argue predominantly in the 1980s, what we see is that women are referred to and addressed as moral subjects. So it is their chastity that's important, and it is their, it is Islamic morality that takes, that becomes central to the official discourses. Flash forward in 2000 and even now, what we see is that women are addressed mostly. Of course, one does not replace the other, that's another thing, but we see a progressive shift towards addressing women as citizens with needs. And I don't want to take much time now. I'd be happy to talk about it during the conversation time, the Q&A, that how it is different to talk about women as citizens with needs than to talk about them as citizens with rights. There is a certain kind of, the state has allergy to our city if you frame women as citizens with rights, but needs have been, anything that has been framed as needs, women have had a better chance of having the state actually responding to it and addressing it. So similarly, we also see kind of a shift or a progressive kind of shift from Islamic discourses where gender segregation is justified based on Islamic values. So, according to Islam, the mingling of unrelated men and women is prohibited or is not encouraged, is discouraged, to secular discourses of either right to the city in the case of buses or the right to healthy bodies and exercise and all these things. So we see the emergence or the increasing kind of usage of the secular liberal languages to the extent that when Ghalibaf, Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf was the mayor of Tehran, who's a conservative, was a conservative mayor of Tehran, he actually, and I highlight this in the book, he actually used kind of what feminist geographers use. And he said, Tehran is a masculine city, it's made by men for men, and we need to kind of, we need to make the city more hospitable to women. The solution to that was expansion of gender segregation. So I talk in the book how some of these liberal secular discourses were turned on their heads by some of the officials. So gender domination still is there because women's presence in public spaces is regulated by the state, and it is actually politicized and at the center of political struggles. But we see a shift from an attempt to exclude or marginalize women to an attempt to include them in spaces from which they were previously excluded. And I try to highlight, instead of seeing the Iranian state as a monolith and homogeneous, I talk about how the state's modality of power has shifted over the past 40 years from kind of presenting itself as the prohibitor, so what women cannot do and where women cannot go, to kind of providing women-only spaces or exclusive spaces for women and kind of channeling desire to these spaces. A very good example of that is how Mahmoud Ahmadinejad called his government. It was Dolat Khidmat Gozar, so it's a state that's a service provider for the population. See, I already got excited, so I put my notes away. This is great. Again, just a quick overview of the book, the 3 chapters. I'm not going to go over this. I'm happy to go over each case during Q&A. But this is basically just quickly for the parks, for example, what I show is how in the 1980s, when you flip through the magazines of that time or the newspapers, you see that there are a lot of interviews and reports about how it is against Islam and Islamic doctrine that or values that women are kind of doing group exercises. They're veiled, obviously, but they were doing group exercises in mixed parks, so Mellat Park, Lale Park in Tehran. At a particular time, the state actually prohibited women's outdoor exercise, and there are a lot of reports and stories about how the park guards became into tension, or that created a lot of tension on an everyday basis with the guards at the parks who were trying to prevent women from exercising. So that's kind of, you see the predominance of this discourse, exclusionary discourse. And the reason for that was that women stretching or jogging in front of men is provocative. And it goes against, Islamic rule of chastity and modesty. Flash forward in 2000, what we see is that the state, through the municipality, is providing women in Tehran with women-only parks. And the state officials, the members of the parliament, city officials are kind of promoting these parks as part of their attempt to provide women with exercise spaces. And the discourse was, there was an official report by the Education Organization of Tehran that mentioned that women are suffering from joint pain, vitamin D deficiency, and their lack of the lack of exposure to sunlight has created, all sorts of skin and hair problems. So the solution to that was, let's have women exercise. And so as we see the expansion of these women-only parks across Tehran, it is justified. So the expansion of these gender-segregated spaces is justified by a recourse to discourse of public health, and women are here referred to as unhealthy citizens. So the same thing goes on for the bus case and the stadium case. I'm happy to go over that. This is just a summary of my park case. I'm happy to go over it as well during the Q&A. But how much time do I have actually? Can you please just send me notes when I have?
Yes, I'll send you a note.
5 minutes into. Okay, perfect. Okay. All right, so just very quickly, because I talk a lot about shifts in gender segregation policies, let me talk about the policy context and what kind of enables this shift or necessitates this shift from prohibition to provision. In the book, I've sketched key aspects of the shifting character of the state as it gradually evolved from a revolutionary ideological construct to a post-revolutionary problem-solving machine. I've demonstrated how a state that emerged out of a revolution that claimed to be inspired by Islam sought its legitimacy in many occasions in convincing its citizens and the international community of its capacity to kind of respond to needs and to solve problems, while at the same time trying to kind of highlight its commitment to ideological, highlight and showcase its ideological purity and commitment to Islam. As the state consolidated itself, it was faced with practical issues relating to improving living conditions and responding to the needs of its population. Thus, the state had to engage in a process of transformation from an institutional constellation predominantly preoccupied with ideological concerns to one confronted with concrete political and practical concerns and the need to address these through both administering its citizens and providing services for them, or engaging in processes of practical problem solving. So a lot of the history of the past 4 decades, in my opinion, I contend, could actually be, when we look at the state, we could kind of summarize it in this tension between ideological kind of imperatives and practical and political problems, and the tension that emerges when the state wants to address these at the same time. This not necessarily linear and uninterrupted transformation of the state was, I argue, marked by a shift from prohibition to provision. So the book provides an account of the institutional workings of the state that made the trajectory from one regime of gender segregation to the other possible. The development of an inclusive gender segregation regime was set against the background of a set of significant factors. On the one hand, the exigencies of shifts in political economy and the external influences stemming from the circulation of both globalized norms and commodities, and on the other hand, international pressures and internal political struggles that became more pronounced as the state diversified in functional terms. So what do I mean by this is that, let me highlight, for example, in the park case, I show that there was an attempt to launch a women-only park in 1993 or 4, if I'm not mistaken, and that failed. And what I argue later is that at that time, this global discourse of cultivating healthy bodies had not yet taken root. And now what you see is that alongside the women-only parks, there are in each neighborhood, in each district of Tehran, you see at least a dozen women-only gyms or yoga classes or Pilates or all of these things. So women in Iran are also part of this kind of global space where these globalized norms are circulating. And the other thing is that we need to take into account 2 things. One is the factions and fractions within the state itself. So I highlight not just the tension between the reformists and the so-called conservatives or the hardliners, but also in the stadium chapter, I highlight how the so-called conservative camp became wrought with tensions, and how a lot of the dynamics that we see around Azadi Sports Stadium had to do with Ahmadinejad's administration wanting to kind of carve out a space autonomous from or separate from the clerics, the very conservative clerics who are actually fundamental in bringing him to power. So a lot of what we see is kind of, what I argue is that we need to take all these kind of internal tensions and conflicts of the state seriously, but also, I also don't think that we should reduce the Iranian state to the national borders. Each state makes decisions, and we can give meaning to it or to its practices if we also look at its relationship to the international community. So the fact that Iran, in the region, in the Middle East region, there is a rivalry between Iran, Saudi Arabia, but also Turkey, that has been kind of influential in many of the state's decision makings, but also the shifts in political economy. Part of it has to do with, economic recessions and problems stemming from the adversity at the international level. So regarding its relationship to its female citizens, the state continued pursuing gender segregation. So in contrast to many people who say women's advancement in Iran shows that the state is withdrawing, or it's, you know, it's a zero-sum game. If women make advancements, it means that the state is weakening or it's withdrawing. I actually show that there are many cases that show the opposite. That as women have expanded, as women's access to public spaces have expanded, as women have demanded more and better access to public spaces and have laid claim, have reclaimed more of the city spaces, the state has actually also expanded its power. So a lot of the obscure everyday corners that were not regulated by the state before have become eventually under kind of the purview of the state. So in that sense, I say that's one of the arguments that yes, we see a gender boundary crisis. We see a shift in the notions of femininity that is no longer bound to home and is mobile and is vocal and is demanding. But the state has not given up its role as the arbiter of gender boundaries. The boundary is shifting from one place to the other, but the state is still there. The metal bar in the bus, inside the bus, that I talk about it as it represents the state, it is still there to signify that the state as the arbiter of gender boundary is there and is present. Even if women sometimes now, as I argue in the book, breach this boundary. Just very quickly, wrapping up, in terms of women, and I'm happy actually to maybe talk about that more in the Q&A, but I wanted to talk about how women feel both in and out of place at the same time. So bring a little bit more nuance or complexity to how we understand the relationship of women with the space, but also with space, but also with the state. Let's show this very quickly. I'll just wrap up there. I'm actually not going to read. So I argue in the book that the way we should understand women's relationship to space and the state in Iran is not through this binary of exclusion or inclusion. Rather, I suggest that we should use the concept of differential exclusion-inclusion, because the terms inclusion and exclusion do not readily convey the complexity and multiplicity of experiences, gratifications, and predicaments of being in and out of place. What this means is that one woman might actually feel included when she is in the women-only park exercising, or when she has a comfortable ride on a gender-segregated bus to her workplace, but she definitely feels excluded when she wants to go to a bowling alley and they don't let her in because women are banned from not all the time, by the way, but anyway, that was one example. On that particular week, they've decided that women are banned from playing bowling, and so they cannot attend. So depending on time, place, and space, and also I argue in the book, I can highlight that in the Q&A, class, the way you feel excluded or included in Tehran varies from time to time. In terms of the state, I also argue, instead of just talking about the state as, reducing everything to gender discrimination and sexism of the state, I talk about flexible sexism. I use or adopt this notion of flexible sexism because, as I show in the book, the exigencies of domestic and international political and economic and bureaucratic circumstances on occasions have required the state not to rigidly police gender boundaries. So that's why we say, that's why we see that sometimes this ambiguity that Iranian women face in their everyday life, I can give you a very short, concrete example. When I was doing my field work, one week we called to go and use the bowling alley. They said if women cannot actually come. So the men went. The second time, within like a few weeks when we called, the same bowling place, They told us, yes, both men and women can come, but you have to play in separate lanes. And then the third time, actually, we all went and we all played together. And this can actually also vary from one bowling place to another. So I'm talking about bowling, a very middle class, upper class, whatever, exercising, but I just wanted to say, so a lot of this ambiguity creates both opportunities and opens up the space in women's everyday life and also closes certain spaces for women. I will stop here and I will let Rachel and others to and Behruz to talk. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nazanin. This is indeed there are so many different layers of this narrative, this story in the book, and each chapter has its own kind of complexities that makes it very difficult to compact all those kind of layered stories into a very short period of time. But let me ask Rachel to intervene here and if you may, just raise some questions or highlight some of the points that you see fit with your own case studies or in general in gender and religion public spaces.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. And I should say that this is a project that I have had the pleasure of watching develop over time. I think I first met Dr. Shahrokni when she was just starting to work on her dissertation. And then I think I'm allowed to say this now, I was a reviewer for her book manuscript. And then, you know,
secrets revealed.
Yes, eventually we can find these things out, right? And then, you know, rereading this book just more recently for this forum, I'm very excited, I think, by the interventions made by this book. And there's so much going on here. I'll probably only be able to point to a few things. But certainly, I think, you know, one of the huge interventions that Dr. Shahrokni makes here is providing, I think, a perspective we haven't seen on the Iranian state vis-a-vis women, and showing that it is not this sort of fixed monolith and that there has indeed been some really important change that's happened over time. And I think she charts those changes really nicely. And does a really wonderful job integrating both historical research and ethnography, which is hard to do. And then certainly also with this conceptualizing of gender segregation, which I really haven't seen elsewhere. And so I think that's one of the things I'm particularly excited about here is the way she's able to show how segregation is not fixed or static, but rather it's a process. And it's not necessarily a linear process, right? And things sort of go back and forth in interesting ways. There are different kinds of segregation, each with their own different motivations and consequences. So I think, you know, I think this book does really interesting work in charting the shift, as Dr. Shahrokni talked about, from prohibiting women from public spaces to more recently providing public spaces for women and then protecting their rights to those spaces. And yet, I think, you know, there's a bit of a tension here, right, that Dr. Shahrokni points to where, you know, even as the state becomes more interested in providing public spaces that are specifically for women, generally speaking, the increased public presence of women does challenge the state's authority. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the broader ramifications of that and, you know, the fact that we do have this trend toward women's increasing public presence in Iran, which ironically has been enabled by the state. I think one of the reasons this is particularly interesting is that for those of us like myself that study places where you know, we don't have state prohibitions on women's presence. And so there is a much larger public presence. And I think this could be said to be true of many societies, in fact, the United States as well. But women's public presence also, we know, is not a guarantee of equality. So it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about those kinds of tensions. And then speaking more about segregation itself, and I really like this idea that when we think of segregation, we tend to think of exclusion, right? But segregation can also be about certain kinds of inclusion. And so perhaps we need to think about exclusion and inclusion as not being a binary, but perhaps even a spectrum. And I think that this is comes out really well in the chapter on buses, which for those of you that have not read the book, it discusses this transformation from post-revolution, essentially really strongly restricting women from buses and giving them only a very small amount of space at the back of the bus. And then later on, an attempt to create women-only buses, which turns out to be a failure and doesn't work very well, particularly in a place where there's a lot of demand for buses. And then more recently, what seems to be a relatively equal split of the buses in terms of the space allocated to men and the space allocated toward women, but often with women in the back, but sometimes in the front. And yet Dr. Shahrokni notes at the end of that chapter that now on the newer buses, which have been privatized, they're more expensive and women start to feel that they have a right to seats. And so occasionally women sometimes take a seat at in the men's section if the women's section is empty. And so in that way, there's somewhat more transgressing of this state boundary. And for me, as someone, as an American growing up in the United States, not surprisingly, this really made me think of the civil rights movement, right? And the battle over space on buses and African Americans being relegated to the back of buses and not being willing to take that after a certain amount of time and starting to challenge that. So I'd love to hear if you think that we might see those kinds of developments in Iran as well, if more women, if you think that they will start to be more demanding about their rights to seats on the bus, particularly in an era of privatization. And related to that, drawing on my own experience doing research in Indonesia, about a decade ago in Jakarta, the commuter trains started to have some women-only cars. And this was a response to increasing complaints about sexual harassment. But it only lasted about 6 months because the trains are incredibly crowded. And so the train company realized pretty quickly that providing several women-only cars meant the other cars got incredibly crowded, and it just was apparently not workable. So that's been dropped. Similarly, the new subway, which is being built in Jakarta and which has just started to operate recently, originally promised to have women-only cars, but then had to scale that back again due to economic constraints. And among Indonesian women and women activists, it's been interesting to see the responses to this. And I think generally there's been a lot of relief, right, that on these very crowded forms of public transportation, where there is often a lot of sexual harassment, that many women are eager to have their own spaces. On the other hand, I think a lot of feminists are rightly quite concerned that, you know, what does this mean as a response to sexual harassment, right? Is the only way to respond to it to actually physically separate men and women. And I think, you know, there's a lot of sort of frustration with that as being an approach, but that's somewhat moot given that the economic constraints seem to make this fairly impossible. And I wonder, I'd love to hear more about the sort of public discussions around this in Iran, particularly as I understand the Me Too movement has picked up in recent months in Iran. And as within Indonesia, there are these increasing public discussions about sexual harassment, you know, in various sorts of spaces, but often focusing on public transportation. And so I wonder how that might impact women's presence in these gender segregated buses. And then that leads me to think about the difference between state-sponsored gender segregation and other forms of gender segregation. And Iran really is one of only a few countries with state-sponsored gender segregation in public spaces. But certainly gender segregation has been practiced around the world in various historical periods, and including in Iran prior to the revolution, right? It was certainly a social practice. In many societies, we know that historically gender segregation was a status symbol, right? That this was a symbol that you had the wealth to restrict women to particular kinds of spaces, or to not have women working, for example. And we see, for example, in Indonesia, there has been somewhat of a trend toward more sort of gender segregation demanded by people who have become more conservative Muslims in recent years, which kind of competes with other trends toward greater inclusion of women. So for example, we have sort of these kind of opposite trends that I've seen, where some often much more conservative young people, are really concerned about gender mixing in various spaces, and have worked to create more segregated spaces. But then on the other hand, we see a trend toward, for example, wearing hijab bathing suits and hijab sports outfits, right? And women actually being able to participate in those kinds of things in ways that haven't really been done before. We now have like hijabi metal bands, for example. So I'm interested in hearing more about what you think are the differences between state-sponsored gender segregation and gender segregation as a social practice. And then finally, just a couple other questions that came up for me. As someone that I've been studying the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on working women in the United States, and I'm sure many of you, are familiar with the recent data that's come out about women leaving the workforce, being pushed out of the workforce due to increased childcare and remote schooling. And so I wondered that, given that women's entry into the workforce in Iran is relatively new, I wonder how the pandemic is affecting women and how it relates to women's public presence. And then one last question, and I know we probably won't be able to get to all of these, but certainly I'd love to hear more about, Dr. Shahrokni, your perspective as someone who's an insider, in the sense that you grew up in Iran and were educated in Iran, and then came to the United States for your graduate education, and have lived around the world. But that also makes you an outsider at the same time. And that's a tension that you explore somewhat in the book. And I'd love to hear more about how you think that's affected, both how you collected your data, how you analyzed it, the reception of the book, perhaps, and what you think those experiences have contributed to your own standpoint.
That's wonderful. So two things. One is that this is an indication that we need to do a part 2 of this conversation, that there are so many important questions on the table. And the other thing is that I wish there were that single Zen word that Nazanin could just mention that one word and it would answer all the questions. But can you stay as close as possible to that one Zen word that can sort of offer some general response to all these questions? Because I also want to go back to the audience and raise some of their questions here as well. So if you can offer some brief comments on Rachel's questions, and then I move on to questions from the audience. Thank you.
I'll try my best. I need vitamin C here. B12, actually, sorry. I don't have the Zen word. Maybe the Zen word is actually what I try to do in the book, but in general, I'm more realizing more and more that what I'm interested in is I'm interested in studying tensions, paradoxes, ambivalence. So as I was actually looking through various parts of the book to figure out how to respond to some of the potential questions, I was thinking maybe what I do is, I don't know, I just came up with the term, the Zen term, ethnography of ambivalence. I don't know. This is how I see it, because a lot of the questions that you asked, Rachel, had to do with some sort of a tension, either the tension in the state. So how does the state actually produce the crisis that then it has to manage? So that's one thing, that's one paradox. And just very quickly in response to that, a lot of the discussions around the Iranian state, particularly outside Iran and particularly in the United States, are refer to the Iranian state as constantly in a permanent state of crisis that can collapse at any moment. Yet it has not collapsed for the past 40 years. So for me, this was actually a very important question. And I wanted to see the different ways in which the state has managed crisis over the past 40 years, including in those crises are the gender boundary crisis that I mentioned. But because Behruz wants me to respond very succinctly, I can expand later. One thing that's very important for me is that, yes, I wanted to at least plant the seeds for us to think about or start exploring about decoupling physical segregation from social exclusion, and think about segregation as, the productive dimension of segregation, as it creates spaces of imagination, of the beyond. And because you mentioned the US and that's your experiences in the US, I just wanted to say that I was giving another talk, and the host juxtaposed my work on gender segregation with Jill Valentine's on lesbian towns in the US back in the 1960s and 70s. And I found that interesting because that also kind of highlights this tension again between segregation from above and separation or segregation from below. These are some of the questions that are very important. I wish we had part 2, part 3, we could continue, but these are some of these questions I'm picking up in my, I'm going to address in my future kind of work, which is more kind of theoretical engagement with segregation. In this book, I zoomed in on Iran. For future work, I'm planning on zooming out and looking at various forms of segregation across the globe. So various forms of how gender segregation is played out in different national contexts, but also different forms of segregation. So racial segregation, class segregation, segregation based on sexuality, neighborhoods, as Amin Ghaziani talks about them. So I think there is something theoretical there to be explored about again, the tensions that we see in gender segregated spaces. In terms of the Rosa Parks comment, just one last thing, and the Me Too, I need to say that. Another thing that I tried to stay away, to the extent that it was possible, I tried to stay away from falling into what Leila Abu Lughod calls romance of resistance, because many scholars who go to Iran to study women's presence in public spaces or women's lives, they look for instances of resistance. In many cases, we have a wide array of literature that kind of documents, rightly so, the heroic efforts of women's movements activists. I was more interested in other forms of what Asef Bayat calls, non-movements or everyday encroachments of the ordinary, how things, so the women in Iran who kind of breach the metal bar in the bus and take a seat in the men's section, I don't compare them to Rosa Parks because they're not part of a broader kind of civil rights movement. So when you talk to them, they do not necessarily situate themselves against or in opposition to the state or the segregation project. In fact, if there are spaces in if there are seats in the women's section, they happily go to the women's section and sit there. I think that was also the picture, at least from Rosa Parks, that we see. There were other empty seats, but she wanted to make a point. And what I say is that we need to take everyday needs and interests into account. A lot of these efforts that we see that happen are just because women want to live a comfortable daily life. And so if there is a seat, they go and take it from the men's section now, if they can. So I will stop at that, and then, I'm happy to carry this conversation further and forward.
I'm glad that you brought that last point up, and I think it's a very important point. And also, I want to kind of bundle a series of questions in a frame that we also, and it's so nicely articulated in the book, that this is also not a kind of state versus society kind of project. And again, we need to, and as Rachel also mentioned earlier, we need to sort of transcend this kind of binary understanding of exclusion and inclusion and the state and society, and see how these kind of boundaries are fluid and porous, and the way people articulate their own position vis-a-vis provisions, regulations, and so on and so forth. So, for example, we have question about Orthodox communities in Israel that they basically generate their own gender segregated spaces, and how can we think about that dynamics? And we have a question about in Saudi Arabia, for example, that many women actually feel very comfortable and at ease in those segregated spaces. And this is also a point that you also talk about, Nazanin, in the book, that even people who are conceptually against segregated spaces, then when they go there, they feel so comfortable and at ease, and also, you know, another question about like stadiums, for example, that this ban. But the matter of fact is that the stadiums are such a masculine, aggressive, and violent space, and it's hard to imagine those spaces as a family outing space, you know, so there are all these complexities there that forces one to think above and beyond this kind of binary understanding of exclusion and inclusion and state society, and bring in all different possible ways that women think about their own space and how they appropriate that space, and in what sense they feel comfortable in these spaces they create or they navigate in those spaces that is imposed upon them by the state. Again, these are a number of questions that address this issue, and I was wondering if you can comment on that. So.
I will try. Yes, one thing that I forgot to respond to Rachel, but also it comes up in some of the questions, was the reference to Me Too movement. And I actually wanted to highlight something that although I think that the Iranian Me Too moment has created spaces of expression of, you know, formerly kind of repressed voices or marginalized voices, I value that. But I am a little bit wary of this kind of branding or emphasis of Me Too, because I think what happens is that it kind of invisibilizes or erases a long history of activism in Iran against kind of sexual harassment, street harassment. There have been many Me Too moments in Iran before Me Too took off. And I thought that is important, not to bundle again all of these kinds of activism as Me Too. And as Behruz also highlighted, one thing that's interesting for me is, yes, there are feminist movements that clearly set themselves and define themselves against the state. But there are also movements, it's called, in terms of Me Too, and it's called Didebana Azar, it's Harassment Watch. So they are actually working closely both with grassroots organizations, but they're also working with city officials. They distribute pamphlets in taxis about manspreading and about groping and about all of these things. And I think recently, if I'm not mistaken, I saw some of their posters installed inside the metro compartments. So there is kind of an array of different forms of activism and actions. Because I try to avoid another Zen word is avoiding binaries, as you highlighted as well, is we see different kinds of activisms and movements, from engaging with the states completely, becoming kind of not necessarily state feminism, but being inside the state. We've had many female state officials kind of promoting women's rights and women's spaces, to completely disengaging from the state. So this tension, again, whether we disengage from the state or engage with it, that's another kind of binary that I try to tackle. This question also about I think you highlighted there was this one of my interlocutors who was ideologically against gender segregation, but then at the visceral level, when we had the interview in the women only park, she actually felt comfortable. I've also had other kinds where women have been, so again, they've been ideologically so in terms of the stadium, I spoke with many women who said that this is absurd, that women are not allowed access to soccer stadiums and everything. But then when I had the follow-up question, so imagine that tomorrow you can go or your daughter can go, or would you go? And many of them said, no, we won't, because the space is not an appropriate. So in principle, they were against the segregation, but in practice, they would actually not go unless, many of them said, unless they kind of figure out something about the space of the stadium. And many of them suggested, if there's a women's section and we are kind of protected, that's fine. So in general, again, what I think is that we need to take into account that subjectivities, not just Iranian women's subjectivities. I think all of us, you also highlighted, myself growing up in Iran and then being in different parts of the world, going back and forth. Subjectivities are formed at the intersection of various discourses that are circulating. This could be a global discourse of healthy body plus an Islamic discourse of modesty, which itself is another global discourse. Various needs and everything. So in general, I think we need to think of subjectivities or individuals as replete with contradictions, ambivalence, and who are formed, and their subjectivities are formed through negotiations of existing tensions and, unresolved kind of issues. And so I think, anyway, I just wanted to highlight that I don't think what I actually realized was that there's no clear-cut subjectivity, right, or individual. Hence the ambivalence that many of the women had, whether religious or non-religious, about these spaces. I thought that's something that needs to be theorized. Yes, I mean the Orthodox community in I've read a few pieces about Orthodox community in Jerusalem and how that's the space of the city there is also segregated. But also what really caught my attention was a piece I read about the Orthodox community in Montreal, but also in New York, trying to create segregated spaces at the heart of these kind of two metropolitan cities. And the author was arguing from the perspective of the right to the city, that as a religious community they have. So there was a tension there between the right to the city as an Orthodox Jew and then the right to the city, and then the implications of gender segregation, or what that means for patriarchy and reinforcement of gender domination. These are, as I said, questions that I would love to explore in future research, or who knows, maybe in the audience, an edited volume of would be interesting.
We are getting very close to the end of our conversation, but before there's so many questions. I will forward you the questions, and at some point maybe we can get to those questions. But one question I wanted to highlight, because I hear this question in many different forms. You do mention in the book, and you mentioned in the talk, that this was about Tehrani women. And how much would this picture change if we go outside Tehran and look at smaller towns and in different more remote parts of the country? How much this story would change, or is it going to be similar? Right.
Yeah, a great question. And since I've received praise today, let me just end this conversation maybe with a criticism of my own work, which contributes to actually a whole body of work that's produced and claims to be about Iran, but really is about Tehran. So I think I fall into that. I can have that criticism, that I also focus mostly on Tehran. But because I was aware of this problem from the beginning, I also tried to kind of at least look at what's happening in other big cities like Isfahan, Tabriz, Mashhad, and even Qom, which is not a big city, but it's big in its influence. So there are 2 points that I want to highlight. One is, surprisingly and ironically, or maybe not ironically, a lot of these tensions that we see in Tehran, because Tehran is the capital, is under the radar. It is very important for the state's performative aspect. So, performing its Islamic identity. A lot of the spaces in Tehran are more politicized than in other cities. So the tensions that we saw, so that's one of the arguments in the book that I say a local problem like access to Azadi Stadium turned into or was scaled up and became a national problem, and then it became a matter of national security. A lot of the women in smaller towns were already going to stadiums, watching soccer matches and attending men's soccer matches. So that's one aspect. The other thing that's also very interesting, perhaps from the perspective of urban planning, which is also sad, is that in a lot of cases, provincial towns were used as a testing ground. So they, for example, the first women-only park in Iran was not launched in Tehran. They actually tried to launch it in a couple of provincial towns, Qom included, to test the reactions and to see first if there is need and there is popularity, but also how would the conservative part of the population, or in the case of Qom, how would the clerics kind of react to that? Once it was tested and the test was positive or negative, depending on what's the best result, then they kind of replicated the same kind of initiative in Tehran as well. So yeah, I stop. I stop at that. I had something that I wanted to say that I am now forgetting, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation, and the book again is so at so many different levels counterintuitive, and I always say that the counterintuitive is the mark of a brilliance in scholarship, and so I highly recommend Women in Place, the book. And please, if you can get a hold of the book and read it, and Professor Rinaldo, Nazanin Shahrokni, thank you so much. This was such a amazing conversation, and it does seem like that we need to have a part 2 of this sometime soon. And again, thank you so much, and thank all of you who attended this conversation.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for engaging so thoroughly with the book and all the encouragement. I appreciate that. And for the audience who didn't get to ask their questions, yes, please, if you forward the questions, maybe we can follow up on the questions in another forum.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.